Oh man, it is confusing. The genie is out of the bottle. People are scared, and governments are scrambling to regulate AI. For example, the Biden White House issued their executive order on AI, and the European Union just released the EU AI Act. These responsible AI regulations are intended to prevent companies from doing bad things with AI. Detecting emotion with AI? That's bad. Using AI to predict who will commit a crime? That's bad. How can business leaders make sense of all of this, especially when making a mistake can be astronomically costly?
What I notice here is that penalties could be 35 million
Ooh.
euros or 7% of global revenue. It depends really on the breach, right? So this is on prohibited practices. You could think of 15 million or 3% in the case of high risk systems, and it goes down from there. But that's a lot of money.
In this episode, I talk with Hadassah from the Responsible AI Institute to try to make sense of all of these government regulations. But before doing anything else, please remember to hit the subscribe button. We have some really exciting episodes coming up on topics such as the AI alignment problem, AI in education, and AI in healthcare.
This is the OpenAI Changes Everything podcast with your host, Stephen Walther, where we explore how OpenAI is transforming the future of humanity.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the show. I am so excited today because today we have Hadassah Drukarch here. And let me give a quick introduction. She is a specialist in technology, policy, and regulation. Currently, she's serving as the Director of Policy and Delivery at the Responsible AI Institute. She is also the founder and executive director at the Law of Tech, an information service group focused on bridging the divide between the legal and tech sectors through a shared language and stakeholder engagement. At the Responsible AI Institute, Hadassah guides the development of responsible AI practice by providing organizations with the necessary tools to advance their digital innovation journey. Founded in 2016, the Responsible AI Institute is an independent and member-driven, not-for-profit organization focused on advancing responsible AI within organizations and nurturing an ecosystem for safe, trustworthy, and empowering AI that serves humanity. Welcome. Thank you for joining us today on the show.
Thank you so much. I'm very excited to be joining you, and apologies for the mouthful of words
Oh, no,
on the
that's
end of the
awesome.
intro.
Well,
It's
there's a
lovely
lot
to be
of
here.
there's a lot of stuff in that intro to dive into, a lot of interesting stuff going on. So let's start unpacking some of that stuff. Let's start with you. You are the direct. Wait, let me get your formal title. You are the Director of Policy and Delivery at the Responsible AI Institute. So let's start there with responsible AI. I'm curious, can you provide us with what is responsible AI?
Yes, that's a really good question. I mean, we're hearing the concept pretty much everywhere. It's become a somewhat of a buzzword, I think. So it's good to kind of dig deeper into what responsible AI is, and then I'm happy to provide a little bit more info about what we do as well. Essentially, when we look at what responsible AI is, I think we need to take a step back and understand that the landscape in which we are operating as tech companies, as legal professionals, ethicists, everyone involved in this ecosystem around AI, is dealing with some challenges. So, on the one hand, regulating artificial intelligence is extremely complex. For instance, given the dynamic nature of AI technologies and the speed at which it's developing, and at the same time, implementing those regulatory requirements, be it binding law or, for instance, best practices or guidances, what we usually refer to as soft law, it's extremely complicated. So we're seeing this kind of divide between the two. On the one hand, how do we keep up with the pace of tech? On the other hand, how do we implement tech? And I think that's where responsible AI comes into the picture. So what a responsible AI essentially does is it offers a governance framework to organizations for them to be able to determine an approach towards artificial intelligence in line with a set of principles that essentially determine what good AI looks like. I know that's sounds like a lot of
No.
vague terminology.
No. I think we're all for good AI. So that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And I did want to ask you about, I know there's something, I was reading up on some of the articles you wrote. By the way, you have a great podcast Law of Tech. I listened to
Thank
a
you.
bunch of those episodes over the weekend. Those are super informative. One of the things
Thank
that
you.
came up was you're talking about the pacing problem or the Collingridge dilemma.
Yes.
And I was curious, yeah, can you tell me more? What is that? What is the pacing problem?
Yes, I can definitely tell you more about that. Also, I love the fact that you researched into this. I've never heard anyone ask me that specific question, so I love it. Absolutely love it. Yeah, essentially, that there are many names that are given to the same issue, but what it comes down to is that regulation is struggling to keep up with the pace of technology. So technology is developing exponentially, whereas regulation, especially when we're talking about public legislation, it develops really slowly. There's obviously in democratic countries a democratic process that underpins such developments, and therefore it's impossible to keep up with the speed of the tech. Yet at the same time, these technological developments are introducing a number of risks, and from a regulatory perspective, we want to keep up with those risks, and we want to ensure that we can mitigate them, or at least provide the guidance and the requirements and obligations to ensure that they are mitigated. So the problem isn't solved. It's one that we are seeing, and from my perspective, likely are going to continue seeing as well.
I'm curious what you think of. I know there's something called the precautionary principle, and which my interpretation is, let's just stop everything until we figure out the risk. Maybe I'm interpreting that in the wrong way. Um, I was just talking to someone from the Future of Life Institute, and they sent off this open letter asking for there to be a pause in all giant, sort of they were targeting really ChatGPT 4 and beyond, asking for a pause in doing this, in doing the research until we understand the dangers more. Curious what do you think about that?
Yes, I was aware of this initiative as well. And my question or my counter question to that would really be with what objective, essentially? Because I understand that it's important to understand the risks, but I think what it comes down to, at least the responsible development of AI, is a behavioral change. So I think it's dangerous to prevent AI developments or tech development or innovation in general. I think that society stands to benefit a lot from the new developments that we are seeing, but I think it's a question for organizations to answer to themselves across the entire organization, also across all stakeholders. How do we change our behavior in such a way that we are able to implement practices that will allow for the developments that we are facilitating to be done responsibly? So that would be my 2 cents on that point. But love to have a discussion on
Nice. So you're an optimist about AI or whatever. So
that.
maybe not. Maybe that's too much. But at least you think the benefits might be worth it as long as we're cautious about how we pursue it. Is that right? So you're not necessarily for hopefully shutting down all of AI research until we figure out what we're doing, but you're for having the right sort of regulations in place so we don't end up shooting ourselves in the foot.
Yeah, I would 100% agree with that.
Okay.
I exactly. That's what it comes down to. That's what we call a positivist. Yes, sure. No, I'm happy to stand behind that for sure. And I think that it's also impossible to stop these developments. We've reached a stage where it's highly questionable what the results would be of doing that, and whether that's actually going to benefit us more. So, yeah, I would
Interesting.
stand behind that.
Well, I've heard some people compare this moment in AI to, so the Manhattan Project, Oppenheimer, about to unleash this technology. And so I've heard different perspectives about, well, if we had it to do over again, maybe it wouldn't have been good to develop, nuclear
Yeah.
warheads, nuclear power. I don't know. These are complicated questions. So I guess I'm curious about, I mean, uh, it's interesting that you're saying you think perhaps we're past that moment where we put the genie back into the bottle again. It's out. People are using it. So, I mean, maybe we already had the Manhattan moment as soon as GPT-3 came out, and now we're trying to catch up with it. I don't know. Is it too late to stick the genie back into the bottle?
I think that only reality could indicate that to us. Whether or not it's too late, I doubt that we are at a stage where we're still able to do that. And I also wonder if that's something we should want to do. So that's kind of my approach to it. I think that the developments that we're seeing across various industries, and one of my favorite is the healthcare industry. That's something that I'm extremely passionate about. the benefits to literally human life that we are seeing coming from that industry and the implementation of new technologies, including AI, are incredible. The fact that we are able to think about life as something extending far beyond what previous generations could have thought of, I think that's a massive benefit. But I do recognize the fact that there are specific use cases in which using AI could be to the detriment of individuals. And I know that, for instance, and I'm sure we'll touch upon this later, the EU AI Act touches upon this specifically, looking at AI from a risk-based perspective and trying to understand, okay, artificial intelligence is here. We are going to benefit from those developments that are good for us, that are helping us out as humans in our daily lives and across many different industries. But at the same time, there are specific areas where we have to be more cautious. And that's where kind of the high risk or prohibited practices come from. I won't go into depth on that. I know that you want to discuss that more later, but I think
Yeah.
that,
Well,
yeah,
let's
that's
dive
your
into
approach.
that now, because I think that's a really great topic. So I know over the past few years, there's been lots of different, government directives, regulations coming out left and right. There's the, what is it? The Biden White House has their blueprint for an AI Bill of Rights. They have the executive order on AI. You just referred to the EU's AI Act. I know actually just like a few weeks ago, a month ago, the National Institute of Standards and Technology just came out with a risk profile for generative AI in particular. And
Yes.
so there's a whole bunch of stuff that they said you shouldn't be doing, don't do it. And so there's all of these, and I got to tell you, as an outsider, it's a little overwhelming, right? There's so many different regulations and so much stuff going. There's even stuff going on at the state level, right? I mean, I know New York passed some stuff about employment law recently, and I know there's
Yeah.
stuff going on left and right. What am I supposed to pay attention to? I guess the question is, or how am I supposed to like remain sort of like knowledgeable, or what's the most important stuff that I should be focused on?
Yeah, I can assure you that for insiders too, it's extremely overwhelming.
I'm sure.
um, so I think there's just a lot coming out now, right? It was silent for a short period
Mhm.
of time, and I think the EU was the leader in this space. You see that in the EU. I'm originally from the Netherlands, also, so I feel like my education in law school, especially in the law and tech space, is focused mainly on what the EU is doing, and that's kind of its unique standpoint, the regulatory perspective. Um, but suddenly, like especially with the generative AI becoming a bigger topic,
Yeah.
everyone followed.
Yep.
Across the globe, we're seeing massive initiatives. The US is one of them, and we're seeing things happening in Canada, in the UK, across the globe, really. I think that what's important to understand is that despite the fact that geographical borders play a role here, the elements that form the basis of all of these pieces of, be it legislation, policy, guiding principles, best practices, they're in essence the same. So there are certain ethical principles, and you can see that very clearly in the NIST AI risk management framework. They include a risk taxonomy, which includes certain principles such as privacy, transparency, fairness, safety, accountability, etc. They all return in these various pieces of regulation. So I think it's important to start to understand what these principles are and really internalize them and understand what it means for you as a professional, as a practitioner, and for your organization more broadly. And then in terms of the actual pieces of legislation, they all have kind of like different contexts and scopes. I would say they are all important in their own way, and I may give a really lawyerly answer and say it really depends when it
Right.
applies.
Right.
If you're a U.S. government agency, the executive order will be extremely important for you. When you're an organization operating in the EU, the EU AI Act obviously is going to knock on your door at some point and say like,
Yeah.
hey, you need to comply with me. But the same applies, especially when you look at the EU AI Act. It will apply to organizations globally, not only to those organizations that are based in the EU, but US companies too will be facing the impacts, let's put it that way, of the EU
Like
AI Act.
I'm guessing very much like the GDPR impacted so many American companies around privacy. I'm guessing that we'll see the same sorts of impact around the AI Act, the EU AI Act on American companies as well as European companies.
Yes, definitely. I think possibly even more so than the GDPR back in the day. But yes, it's the exact same process that we're seeing now.
So I wanted to dig in a little bit on the EU AI Act, and I notice. Well, actually, yeah. Can you describe what does the act do? What does it make me do? Should it be, does it prevent me from doing anything I want to do? I don't know. What's that? What's it look like? And yeah, how's it structured? How does it impact the way? If I'm a company, if I'm a CEO about to embark on a major like AI initiative, what do I need to know about it?
Yeah. So I think the first, kind of like linking to what we were just talking about, I think a first point that's really important to understand is whether the EU AI Act applies to you. And that depends on two factors. The first one is whether or not your company operates within the EU, meaning that, for instance, you're established in the EU. But secondly, if the AI systems, products, applications that you are developing impact EU citizens. So you could be a US company based in the US, or it could be based anywhere in the world. But if your AI systems that you use or are developing impact other individuals that are EU citizens, then you're going to fall within the scope of the EU AI Act. So that's step one, I would say. Secondly, once you have determined the AI Act is going to apply to me, you will have to understand this risk-based approach that the EU AI Act focuses on. So there are four risk categories that the AI Act focuses on. The first is prohibited practices or unacceptable risk levels. Now, those are considered to be those AI systems that are not acceptable, are developing, like, and you could think of, for instance, coercive AI systems, exploitative AI systems, so those AI systems that are manipulating people into making decisions without being informed about them, and that could potentially harm them. You could think of those that are exploiting vulnerabilities of individuals, for instance, based on gender or age. You could think of emotion detection systems, what we were just discussing, but in specific contexts. And there are plenty more. Social scoring is another option. They really give a clear list of those systems that you are not allowed to develop, and they're prohibited under the EU AI Act. Those are kind of clear, I think, on that end. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Oh, yeah. No, I'm
No?
just curious. I mean, the prohibited ones. I'm curious how they came up with this list because some of them. I mean, the one thing about the EU Act, I noticed that was very specific about very much against social scoring, very much against which I mean, I think it's great. I don't want a social score. I'm not trying to defend that, but it's interesting how specific it was and the motion detection, which I know we were talking a little earlier, right before the podcast, about GPT 4.0 just came out this morning. It has a lot of emotion detection stuff built into it. Their big live demo they did when they streamed the announcement was, GPT 4.0 picking up on a person's emotion from their voice. And they even took used the video. And the person asked, well, what emotion do I have right now? It said, oh, you're happy and excited about announcing the new GPT 4.0. And so that seems like it, it seems tricky because some of the stuff that they're talking about, I guess it's it's a low. I guess I'm wondering where did they come up with the specific things that they want to prohibit, and some of them seem a little because I mean, China obviously famous for using social scoring. So I mean, it feels if I think one of the general issues I keep running into understanding sort of even things like the alignment problem with AI and all this regulation is as a species humans haven't like aligned on all the stuff that we think is good. We don't have a common morality, and so it's challenging when we're trying to regulate this new intelligence we're introducing to the world when we ourselves still haven't figured out a lot of this stuff. So it's interesting to me sort of the sources of these regulations and the process that people go through to be able to figure out what we want our new babies, our AI babies that we're introducing in the world, what we want them to be able to do. And I was wondering if you could provide maybe some insight into what's that process look like for developing these regulations.
Yeah, I think there's a lot that goes into it, and I agree with you that we as humans have got no clue really ourselves, like what we care about and what we think is good and what isn't good. And that's a question that is going to remain. I think what is good, what is bad.
Yeah.
I think those are questions that go back way further than pure AI regulation. But what we saw with the AI Act is that it was based originally on a white paper, and they had a special committee that was working on the topic of AI. So there was the idea we need to regulate AI. That was like step one. considering the benefits and balancing it against the risks, we will have to regulate AI. So research is done about what is AI. That's been a very big topic also in the EU AI Act. How do we define AI in the first place?
Oh, that's interesting. So even figuring out what
Yeah.
counts as an AI system is challenging. Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes sense.
everything is challenging because
Yeah,
nobody really knows quite yet what the topic is that we are regulating, and you need a
yeah,
lot of expertise to do that, right? I think that as opposed to what used to be the scenario where policymakers were or had more expertise on the topic that they were working on. In this specific case, when we talk about AI, the topic is so complex
yeah.
that you're going to need way more expertise at your table as a policymaker than what you were used to. And there is going to be disagreement, and there are interests. There are always interests at stake. So it's a really hard topic to regulate. And I think to get to the point that you just made about, why are there specific prohibited practices, the list seems to be limited. It certainly won't be,
Mm,
because this is what we know right now.
I see.
They're based on case studies, right? With social
Yeah.
scoring is taken as an example because we've seen that. Another one is the scraping, for instance, of images off of the internet for facial recognition databases.
Yep.
Well, we have certain companies that have become famous for this
Right,
type
right.
of behavior. So I think that case studies form the basis for what we consider good and bad. And a lot of research, academic research, also forms a basis of kind of the direction in which these policy documents, these policy frameworks are heading.
Got it. So this is it's almost like we're wandering around in the dark. We keep knocking our feet into, stubbing our toes on things and going, "Oh no, this is awful. We better, try to prevent this," because in the case of like facial recognition or some of the other cases that you talked about, it's caused problems. And so I guess the optimistic way of seeing this is it's evolving. We're going to discover things as we go along, probably unpredictable ways that AI will do
Yeah.
horrible things. I mean, we have a big election coming up in the U.S. It fills my heart with fear to think of all of the ways that with the deep fakes and automatic personalized emails and all this stuff. I'm a little terrified what the election's going to look like with these new
Yeah.
superpowers in people's hands. But I guess what you're saying is the hope is that our regulations will evolve to keep pace with the technology. As evildoers keep learning to do new evil things, we'll have to try to figure out how to block that. Is that right?
Yeah, I definitely think that's the approach right now, because some things we're just not going to know until we see them. The idea behind the AI Act, for instance, is to create it in a tech neutral way, meaning that the legislation that we're looking at should be well, future proof, we could say. It's written in a way that allows for new developments to fall within its scope. But what happens when there's a specific list of prohibited practices? What if we find something that's new that
Yep.
we haven't accounted for yet? These are questions we just don't know the answer to yet.
And I'm sorry, I think I interrupted you. You were talking about there were different risk levels that the EU AI Act, and I think we got stuck on prohibited, but are there other risk levels too?
Yes. So yeah, Vinny, there's prohibited practices. It says it in the name, they're prohibited. We have high risk AI systems. Those are the most complicated category, I would say. Those or encompass those systems that are considered to have a significant impact on human beings, and can be detrimental to them. There are a lot of requirements that have been listed in the EU AI Act. So all the requirements that you see, except for some transparency obligations, they apply to high-risk AI systems. So it's, for instance, checking on the data that your AI system is trained on to ensure that bias is prevented, or negative bias at least. There are documentation requirements. There's a whole bunch of requirements that the AI Act lists. They apply to high-risk AI systems.
Okay, so this is more like not necessarily specific things are being prohibited, but now that with certain systems, we want to pay extra attention to them because they have the potential to impact hiring or impact education or impact stuff that we really care about. So we just want to be laser focused to make sure that there's nothing unexpected in their behaviors.
Yes, although I have to say that the EU AI Act does provide some assistance in understanding what
Hmm.
high-risk AI systems are. So all the way at the back of the document, you'll find Annex 3, I believe it is, if I say that correctly. And in that annex, the European legislators aim to provide some guidance. So you could see specific areas in which AI systems are being operated. For instance, critical infrastructure,
Oh,
employment, or recruiting,
yep.
law enforcement, a whole bunch of use cases for AI systems. Those are considered high
Right.
risk.
Which when I read the thing about, sort of law enforcement and sentencing, of course, my mind went directly to Compass and all over the, it's still, which Compass is still heavily used in the United States. So again, I was
I
sort
can't
of,
believe that, honestly.
I
I
know,
had no clue about that.
but I guess, there's another example, like, I guess like social scoring where, it's already kind of implemented and used, and there's still a sort of argument going around about around how discriminatory Compass is. And so it's interesting to see it, actually that specific scenario cited within the EU.
Yeah, that's exactly like an example that you could pull up based on the high risk AI systems. There are
Yeah.
also some prohibitions, so prohibited systems in the law enforcement space. But there's a fine line between the two, right? And the requirements that the EU AI Act sets out aim to provide those organizations that are developing these high risk AI systems with, well, requirements that they have to comply with in order to prevent issues like those with Compass to recur again. But then you kind of get again to that question: how do you actually implement this in practice? But I won't go into that right now.
Okay, so we have prohibited systems, we have high risk systems. Where does it go from there?
Yes, then we have the final two categories, which are the easiest, I would say. They are limited risk AI systems. There's no specification exactly as to what they entail. There are some examples. You could think of deepfakes, for instance, or also emotion recognition also forms a part of this.
Hmm.
Those systems need to comply with transparency requirements. So you need, as an individual, you need to be aware of the fact that you're interacting with such systems.
Hmm.
So kind of getting back to that discussion on US elections,
Yeah.
you would have to know that you are interacting with
Yeah.
fake content or with deepfakes
Well,
or some sort of
it's not
manipulated content.
Trump reaching out to me directly and knowing my personal history and having a one-to-one conversation. Yeah. That
You'll
makes
be
sense.
surprised. There are plenty of people that would think that.
Yeah, right.
But that's essentially like a relatively easy category. There are transparency requirements laid down in the act, and you would have to comply with those. So really just being transparent about the fact that you are using an AI system and those using it should be aware of that. And then we have minimal risk systems, and they are considered to be of such little risk that there are no requirements that apply to them. So that's the final category.
Got it. And what would be an example of a minimal risk system? I mean, does ChatGPT fall into that, or is that more like specialized AI for specific, I don't know, cases that are non-controversial?
I think that, well, I guess with ChatGPT, we kind of dig deeper into that generative AI discussion, which,
Yeah.
or general purpose AI, which the EU AI Act kind of bombarded with discussions very late in the process. I would say in terms of like minimal risk systems, you could think of things or systems that I would say as an example, but don't pin me down on this. If you're
Yeah.
looking at the recommendations of sports games outcomes,
Okay.
the outcome of a sports game,
Okay.
I could imagine that that would be a limited risk
Got
AI
it.
system.
Wow, I can make a
Um,
lot of money on that. Wait, now
I'm
I've
not
never.
sure, but I would assume something
Yeah.
like that. Yeah,
Okay.
no requirements,
Okay.
nothing.
Nice. Okay.
Let's do it.
Right. Okay. I'm going to quit my job and just focus on betting using ChatGPT. That's an awesome idea. Well, yeah. So I did want to ask you about they have they seem to treat the EU AI Act seems to treat what they're calling general purpose AI, GPA AI, differently than other types of AI. And I think you just said that I'm assuming this is because GPT was released kind of late in the process, and so they were trying to get their minds around it. But yeah, can you tell me how does the EU Act, like think about Chat GPT, which isn't for a specific purpose, but I can ask it any question I want. I can, interact with it however I want. So how do they I don't know, handle systems like that?
Yeah, it really was. I don't know if it came as a surprise, but it definitely shook up kind of the discussion in the kind of development towards the EU AI Act, and all the way at the end of the debates and just before adoption. This was still a really big discussion point because the opinions varied, and again, there were a lot of interest at stake, a lot of interest involved, and you saw this kind of not I wouldn't call it a conflict, but at least like a serious debate on how to regulate these general purpose AI systems. Eventually got into the AI Act, and it is regulated as a kind of separate category. There are specific requirements that apply to it. I won't go into the details because it's like quite technical, but I would say that transparency, documentation, trying to essentially provide those organizations that are going to make use of such systems a peek behind the wall, the door, to understand what's happening within the development of such general purpose AI systems. And then they also differentiate between regular GPAI and GPAI that causes systemic risk, so really high computing power. That's kind of like what it comes down to. And they have some additional requirements in terms of documentation, in terms of transparency, etc. So somewhat different approach,
Yeah.
but definitely regulated.
Got
Uh,
it.
Although I have to say, what the outcome will be is still really questionable. Like the way we have to, or the way we will be implementing these requirements. I was on a panel discussion recently. It was back in February, and this was one of the points. People who are very well versed in IP law, for instance, and asking questions as to how do we actually make this practical now? Like, what does this mean for developers and for those organizations using or using GPAI? A lot is still unclear, so
Yeah.
we're gonna see.
Well, so let's try to make this, well, back to sort of a practical level. If
Yeah.
let's say I'm a CEO of a company in the United States, and I'm feeling overwhelmed by all this AI regulation. I'm not quite sure what to do because there's all these different regulations out there. What should be keeping me up at night? What should I be losing sleep over right now in terms of the regulations? I mean, I know, just about every company I'm talking to, they have massive AI initiatives that they're launching right now, many of them multi-year, initiatives. If I'm, putting a bunch of bets down on AI powered products, what should I be worried about?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that at this point, I think one thing is important to understand for all organizations is that we're dealing with a really new space. So a lot is going to be unclear. If that wasn't clear from the from the points I made, like there's a
Right.
lot that we're trying to understand, and there are a lot of lessons learned, or there are a lot of lessons that are going to be learned across this journey. So I think that's like an important point. Nobody really knows yet quite what the impact is going to be of these new developments. That's point one. Then I would say if you're an organization and you're developing, using, deploying, procuring AI, I think there are three main points that are important to draw your attention to. And that is, first of all, that point of compliance. I think the question that starts there, or that kind of or introduces the topic of compliance, is where do I start? And a lot of organizations are asking that. We see that within our own organization at the Responsible AI Institute as well. A lot of organizations want to know, where do I start with compliance? And I think a good starting point there is to make an inventory of the AI systems that you're currently using, that you are developing, that are related to your organization. So understand what you're busy with. And then kind of move on from there, understand your maturity, and then go on to the requirements at a system level. So compliance is the first point that will keep you awake, but start with a question: what do I have? Then I would say another point is consumer trust plays an important role. You, as an organization, are going to want to at least internalize what I mentioned earlier, those basic principles, create a policy for your organization on AI, at least outward looking, indicate that you are leading in this space, that you are at least making the efforts, because the whole kind of point of this responsible AI field, or what's also termed trustworthy AI, the idea behind it is to generate trust among your consumers, among your customers. If you lose that, you're likely going to lose face. And that can be a problem when you're trying to innovate, when you're trying to get your products that you're developing to be adopted.
Yep.
So I would say that's an issue. And then finally, I would say that you also want to prevent regulatory or technical debt as you are moving towards the final stages of the life cycle of your AI system, right? You want to, what we like to talk about in the EU, do this by design. You want to implement the requirements, or at least the behavior, the efforts at the start of the development or the deployment of your system. You're not going to want to do this later on when compliance is mandatory. We're at a really nice stage right now where the AI Act hasn't entered into full force yet. There are periods of time that are going to have to pass before they actually apply. We are working with countries where there isn't even a binding piece of legislation yet. I would say that organizations are at a really unique point right now to internalize what is going on and get ahead of that curve before well, I wouldn't say before it's too late, but before it will be expensive.
Right. Well, yeah. So let's talk about the expensive part. So what are the negative repercussions of not following through on these regulations? What is the fear there? I know like GDPR has some pretty big financial penalties. Is there something similar around the AI Act or some of these other regulations that we're talking about?
Yes, it's exactly the same approach. There are really hefty fines on breaching the prohibitions and the requirements laid down in the AI Act. The idea, of course, is to prevent organizations from doing that. We haven't seen any fines yet, obviously, because the act isn't in force yet, but I'm sure we will be seeing this as time passes by. And they're really hefty. I think potentially I'd have to look at what the exact numbers were or the percentages, but they are more hefty even than the GDPR fines were previously. So I would definitely suggest to take a look at least, or to understand what the AI Act says, because the consequences are real.
I'm looking up here. It says this is from your website, by the way, the Responsible AI Institute. It says EU Act and the Canada Data and AI Act are planning up to 6% of revenue and even criminal
Yes.
punishment for non-compliant systems. Yeah, so that seems like a lot. Yeah, I don't know. 6% of company revenue is sufficiently
Yeah,
scary
that is
for
a
me.
lot. Indeed, and I can see here as well. I wrote a piece on the AI Act within our. We have. I'll talk about that as well, of course, a little later. But in our member hub,
Yeah.
that we have launched to our members exclusively, and later also hopefully to, or our goal is to also open it up to the public. But what I notice here is that penalties could be 35 million
Ooh.
euros, or 7% of global revenue. It depends really on the breach, right? So
Mm.
this is on prohibited practices. You could think of 15 million or 3% in the case of high risk systems, and it goes down from there. But that's a lot of money.
It is. Yeah. Substantial chunk of money.
Yes.
Okay. Well, so I'm curious more about the how you work with companies and member organizations with the Responsible AI Institute. How can you help companies navigate all these confusing regulations? How do you engage with companies? What's it look like?
Yes, so we are or the Responsible AI Institute is an independent, community-driven, and member-based nonprofit. What that essentially means is that we work with members, which consist of various kind of categories. We have corporate members, we have ecosystem collaborators, and we have the academic institutions and government organizations. And what we do is, together with their help and for them, we are developing ways for them to advance responsible AI in practice through the tools that we develop, the resources that we develop, benchmarks. You could think of certification programs, assessments, other relevant resources and guidances. And the aim of those tools and those resources is to provide them with the practical and actionable tools to put responsible AI into practice. So that's essentially what we do as an organization, and it's based on the pain points that we see within the market. And I think that's where our approach as a member-driven and community-based organization is quite unique. We really listen to what organizations are facing in terms of challenges on the ground, and based on that, we develop our tools and our resources for them. specifically.
So if I'm a large company about to embark on a major AI initiative, I just have no idea what kind of dangers I'm going to get myself into, it would make sense for them to reach out to the Responsible AI Institute, and you could perhaps help guide them around assessments and getting the proper programs in place and certification so that they have more of a hope of trying to navigate all this stuff. Curious I know you recently went through a certification process with a couple of your member organizations. Can you tell me a little more about that?
Yes, also thanks for that description. I think you did a way better job than I could have. So that's great. No, indeed, we did go through a pilot program. Just to give a little bit of background and to kind of touch upon what you were just saying as well. In terms of the assessments that we offer and in terms of kind of the process, we offer organizations a roadmap to understand really from the beginning all the way until the end, how they can approach AI responsibly. So that starts with our first assessment program, which is the organizational maturity assessment. That focuses more on the governance and organizational level, meaning is your organization ready to implement artificial intelligence, to develop it? We can look at people. We are looking at education, training, governance, all of those types of topics. So that's part one. So that's where an organization could start also. Do you want to start with developing AI? Our organizational maturity assessment is a really good place to start. Then we move on to something that I've been working on more extensively recently, and that is the system level assessment. And that's where the pilot also comes in. So the system level assessment was part of a pilot with the Standards Council of Canada. I think that's one that you're referring to. And together with one of our members, ATB Financial, which is a Canadian financial institution, and Fairly. So what we essentially did, the SCC, the Standards Council of Canada, was working on a pilot themselves, and it consisted of two parts. One focusing more on the governance of AI, and there's a standard, an ISO standard that focuses on that. And the second part was on the system level assessments. They essentially wanted to understand, how do we work with assessments for AI, and how can we turn them into, say, a certification scheme, something that we can test against in this time where there are a lot of regulatory frameworks and we don't understand, how to make them practical and how to comply with them. So that's what the pilot was all about, and we did that together with one of our member organizations, ATB Financial. They were the certification seeking organization. SEC was the body that was looking at accrediting our scheme. Yep. We were the holders, and then Fairly was kind of like the expert, where we needed some extra expertise on the topic. So that's the pilot, and we're doing that again now. A lot of lessons learned from that phase. It was really interesting. I wasn't there yet. Wasn't part of the organization at the time when this pilot was performed, but the lessons we've learned are informing the way we are advancing and improving our assessment right now. And we are once more performing a pilot. The details will become more public later on, but we're looking at it from a somewhat different perspective. Namely how a third-party assessor can actually perform the assessment necessary for certification. So for an organization, and that's the goal, at the end of the day, to go through this process and be able to get what we call a responsible AI certification mark that says you have complied with our scheme. And with that, you comply with the objectives of existing standards, regulations, and best practices, including, for instance, the AI Act or the executive order. So that's what we've been up to.
Awesome. Well, so how can members of the audience learn more about responsible AI? Where's the first place to start on that?
I think this would be a great opportunity to promote our work, but I would start first with the fact that I genuinely believe in the power of community in this space. And I think that rather than recommending specific sources such as books or news channels or other, definitely listen to this podcast, that's for sure. But I would say look for a community in this space with professionals that are facing the same challenges. And I'm seeing this being created more and more. LinkedIn, even though some may think it's not the greatest place, some may think it's amazing, I think LinkedIn is a great place to start. But there are other community sites, other organizations that are developing communities, including our own organization. We have the Responsible AI community with just over 1,000 members. I would suggest be a part of that. And these communities are developing more and more. Like I just mentioned, we have created now, because of the traction that we've seen, a community hub that is available to our commercial partners, our members. But later this year, we will also be sharing more about how this platform will become public to the rest of the Responsible AI audience, meaning individual members, individual professionals. And the goal really is to bring people together so that they get an insight of what's important and can stay up to date with the latest developments. So community is the word, I think.
Community. Awesome.
Yes.
Well, so before we wrap up, is there any sort of, general advice you want to give the audience? Any closing thoughts on responsible AI? What's the one thing you want people to take away from this?
I would say maybe I don't know if that's a good piece of advice, but get started with something.
Okay.
Like I said, get started by asking the question, what do you have? I think just that first step is the most important step, because once you're into it and once you've understood how to get started, it will become a lot easier to continue that journey. That would be my advice.
Nice. Well, thank you so much today for spending the time answering all my very ignorant questions about all this very complicated stuff. Super appreciate you taking the time, and thank you again.
Thank you so much, and keep up the great work. It's a lovely podcast. Thanks for the invitation.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for the OpenAI Changes Everything podcast, where we explore how OpenAI is transforming the future of humanity. Please remember to subscribe to ensure that you receive future episodes.